of the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, Missouri. He's been the curator since 1990 and senior curator since 2011. He's been involved in the restoration of the memorial, the creation of the current world-class museum, and the growth of the museum collection into the most diverse collection on the Great War. He has a Bachelor of Arts in History from Indiana University and a Master's of Arts in Museum Studies and History from the University of California, Riverside. Since he started his professional career in 1974, Doran has worked in museums and historic sites and in historic preservation from Indiana to California to Florida and finally now Kansas City. He has written a number of articles on historical subjects and edited 2 books. He's been interviewed on national news, and he is with us today to talk about volunteers, American volunteers, over there during World War I. Please help me welcome Doran.
I used this joke yesterday, but I'll use it again today. It's always a hazard when people clap before you say anything. There's a certain amount of expectation that I'll actually say something astute. I hope I do, but I hope I say something you've never heard before, so we'll go that way. And I really wanted to talk about volunteers in the war today because this is a really important subject in my viewpoint, because it was an incredible mobilization of the entire American public. And it really started when pistol shots of assassination in a Sarajevo street on June 28, 1914, ignited the match of war. Quickly, the growing flames led to threats, armies mobilizing, war being declared. Let me set my timer here. War being declared and dreadnoughts steaming to war. War was romantic. War was colorful. Flags, spiked helmets, and flashing sabers. War was an adventure. Those called to arms would be heroes, defending their homelands and way of life. German troops attacked France through Belgium in August 1914, triggering a world war the likes of which had never been seen before. Belgium would bear the brunt of the first German offensives of the war. The Belgian king, Albert I, led a small army in a gallant but ultimately futile defense. Formerly neutral Belgium became an occupied war zone. As starvation threatened millions there and elsewhere, individual volunteers and organizations such as the Commission for Relief in Belgium mobilized American neutrality for humanitarian relief on an epic scale. Chairman Herbert Hoover negotiated directly with European governments to organize relief on an unprecedented scale. 35 commissioned staff worked with 40,000 Belgian volunteers to distribute food and to prevent confiscation by the German military. Individual Americans immediately volunteered for humanitarian and military service, primarily with the Allies after the war broke out. They volunteered as ambulance and truck drivers, hospital workers, doctors, and nurses. They crossed into Canada and received military training and were sent to Europe to fight under Allied flags. Americans joined the French Foreign Legion. They volunteered for adventure. They volunteered to see the world, even one torn by war. They volunteered for the better good. They volunteered because their friends did. They volunteered because they wanted to make a difference. American volunteer organizations contributed immensely to the well-being and welfare of the American men and women later serving in the American military. but also to peoples in war-torn countries around the globe. Volunteers from such widely varied organizations such as the Knights of Columbus, the YMCA, the YWCA, the American Library Association, and countless other local, regional, and national groups provided labor, food, entertainment, physical and emotional support, and respite from the war. All volunteers' contributions were without bounds and absolutely necessary. Some gave their lives. The American Fund for French Wounded was founded by American women living abroad to provide relief to small hospitals in France. They raised funds in 80 United States municipalities to provide medical assistance for wounded French soldiers and civilians and other forms of support for refugees. After the outbreak of war, staff at the American Hospital of Paris converted an unfinished high school in the prosperous Paris suburbs into a wartime military hospital to accommodate a large number of patients. This civilian-run, military recognized hospital, referred to as an ambulance in French, was used to treat the large number of wounded soldiers returning from the front and became the hub for American volunteer activity in France. In April 1915, A. Piet Andrew, who you see up there in the left corner, who was the former director of the U.S. Mint, he volunteered with the American Ambulance Hospital. He convinced the French military to allow some of its ambulance units to serve closer to the front. Rather than transporting wounded from train stations in Paris, his ambulance drivers in the new units drove to and from dressing stations near the battlefields and shell-torn roads, sometimes in the line of fire. While there were other American volunteer groups in Europe doing ambulance work at the time, Andrew's American Ambulance Field Service later became known as the American Field Service. It became the largest. When American Field Service volunteers arrived in Paris, they were assigned to an all-American section, supervised by a fellow volunteer, assisted by French cooks and handymen, and commanded by a French officer. They were sent out in sections of 40 men each, 2 drivers per car. They were known as a Service Sanitaire, SSU. As typical ambulance section, Section 3 was organized in Paris in April 1915. It was sent to the Vosges Mountains in 1915, and this ambulance service section transported wounded soldiers who participated in the early actions of the Battle of Verdun, and in 1916 they moved to the Balkans with the French Army of the Orient. At Verdun, American driver Alan Innes Brown wrote in July 1916, "The first night of our service at Verdun began. 15 of our 20 cars rolled along the main Verdun road past the long line of trucks, ammunition wagons, and soup kitchens, then into the city itself, through the ruins of heavily shelled districts, and across the river just to the outside of town at our small post. That night, the Germans were making a gas attack, and they threw thousands of gas shells upon the French trenches and beyond. The gas reached us, and men not equipped with proper masks began to cough and choke, and were sent deep into a cellar where the air was still fresh. AFS volunteers provided their own uniforms, clothing, and personal equipment, and arranged their own traveling expenses from U.S. to France and from France back home. Aside from this, everything was provided to them. AFS provided board and lodging during training and in Paris when on leave. Even though they were volunteers, they were given 2 francs a day to help with their incidentals. that supplemented their French Army rations. They were provided ambulances, many from the United States, trucks, trailers, staff cars, parts, cars, and section equipment, tents, and tools. Just to give you an idea, just an incredible amount of materials that had to be gathered just for volunteer units. The French Army furnished gasoline, oil, and tires, and provided regular Army rations and lodging for the men in the field. Just one document I'd like to point out there in the center, where it says American Ambulance Field Service. This is from all these materials are from our collection. But that one really shows that he was checking it off on the list as he was getting the equipment that was available and then to be obtained in Paris, so they didn't have to carry all that stuff overseas with them. Another ambulance service, the Reserve Ballet, was the collective name for a series of units known individually as Transport Matériel États Unis, which were engaged in the transportation of munitions and supplies for the French. So they wore French insignia, which you see here. Other volunteer units consolidated with the American Red Cross. American ambulance drivers served in Russia and the Balkans as well. After the United States joined the war, the U.S. government turned the American Red Cross into a branch of the U.S. military to draw the people of the U.S. into, as Woodrow Wilson said, a great intimate family. And did you know, and it's still true today, that the president then and now was the official head of the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross went from 238,000 members in late 1916 to 6.4 million in June 1917. The organization raised more than $100 million for relief at home and abroad. More than 35,000 individuals were in the YMCA entertainment operations at home and abroad. The entertainment policy was to play anywhere and everywhere the men might be, in order to relieve, if only for an occasional evening, the strain and tension of war. One of the YMCA entertainers, that we have her materials in our collection, including this outfit she's wearing, she wrote, "They brought the gospel of laughter, the song of sentiment, that soared like a wave of comfort to tired and homesick men." Eleanor Washburn not only performed, but she also scheduled and arranged performances from lecturers, ventriloquists, banjo players, dancers, vaudevillians, magicians, dramatic readers, and chalkologists. Now, a chalkologist we don't hear much about today, but they actually would put a chalkboard up in front of the soldiers, and they would tell, "What do you want to see drawn?" And the guy would yell out a dog or whatever, and the chalkologist would draw it. That was their entertainment. One doughboy, and I'll give you the real meaning of the doughboy at this point. It had nothing to do with his buttons, nothing to do with white belts, or the Civil War, or being made out of dough like the Pillsbury Doughboy. It came from when the American infantry was serving on the border between the United States and Mexico. We're still doing it today. And the infantry would march, and the cavalry would ride by, of course, and they would cover the infantry with adobe brick dust that was there. And so they would yell out, "Look at the marching adobes." So it went from adobes to dobies to doughboys. And that's where it came from. And it didn't start in the Civil War or any other place. The first recorded information about the term doughboy was 1960. And the doughboy that I've identified now wrote that he remembered a Red Cross canteen worker standing behind a counter wearing a soiled uniform and doling out letter paper. And one thing I was impressed with the entire exhibition here on the World War I, not only because we loaned a lot of materials from World War II. I said that because the staff, a lot of staff's in here. But also, when you go into the recreation of the hut, they have people write letters and put them up on the board. And this was a very important part of the volunteer effort. And he continued, when the Red Cross canteen worker shook hands with me, her hands were chapped and red from days spent in washing chocolate cups. In the summer of 1917, just right after the Americans entered the war, more than 100 American relief organizations were active in France. One of them was the American Library Association, which had been founded in 1876. It quickly developed a War Service Committee, which managed the organization, shipment, and distribution of books, magazines, and other periodicals to soldiers at camps at home and abroad. The American Library Association believed they could do their part in the war by distributing literature, which would provide the soldiers with a mental escape and a sense of normalcy during the chaos of war. One of the camp librarians, Esther Johnson, led an incredible effort because the camp she was in was near where a lot of the African American troops were stationed. And of course, African American troops were segregated from the other troops, especially the Anglo troops in the American Expeditionary Forces. She wanted to help them by furthering their education, and she utilized the books provided by the American Library Association and began a beginner's reading program for many of these illiterate men. The Salvation Army originated in 1865 in London, but quickly spread to the United States. It was founded as a faith-based, try to say that twice, faith-based organization. The Salvation Army's objective was to evangelize and advance Christianity through charitable efforts, alleviate poverty, and benefit the community as a whole. By 1917, the Salvationists, both men and women, wanted to serve the American Army any way possible. They had clothing drives, they planted war gardens, and provided writing material and toiletries. The Salvation Army sought to provide aid where it was needed most and spread the news of the gospel. During World War I, the Salvation Army surged in popularity, and the women's Salvationists, also known as lassies, were a primary reason. Salvation Army realized they could provide a cheerful, comforting, and true domestic environment even while in the trenches of war. They smiled through constant terror and took on the motherly role that so many men longed for. The lassies sang, provided sweets, held church services, patched uniforms, and even baked for the men. They did not, however, and we've had this discussion in the last few months, they did not, however, invent donuts. Donuts were actually invented in 1854. They were the first in the field to produce donuts, but almost all volunteer organizations produce donuts, and I didn't know until yesterday, when I saw a document here in the archives, that they also, especially the Knights of Columbus, made cinnamon rolls and pumpkin pies. So that was new to me, and I've been in this museum for 28 years in my museum, and that's the first I'd heard that. So we're always learning. The Jewish Welfare Board was organized in 1917 to help meet the war needs. The board established over 200 centers for servicemen and women in stateside training camps and overseas. The board was part of the larger United War Work campaigns. The Jewish Welfare Board consolidated religious groups in the Jewish community to become an official agency to work with the War Department through its commission on training camp activities. It was modeled after the Knights of Columbus and other organizations that in World War I adapted military-like uniforms for women and men volunteers. The JWB built buildings and stocked libraries, distributed books, articles, prayer books, and other materials through their publication society. In most African American communities, there was an overwhelming volunteer support for the Liberty Bond drives in 1917. On the home front, the contributions to the war effort were varied and successful, including the Women's Auxiliary of the 15th Regiment, individual efforts by Eva Bowles, and these are terms that they used at the time, so I hope I'm not offending anyone, but she was the Secretary of the Colored Women's War Work in Cities. Alice Dunbar Nelson was the recognized leader of mobilization of Negro women for the Council of National Defense, and Louise Ross was the chairperson of the New Orleans chapter of the American Red Cross. African American women worked with the Women's Motor Corps, nationwide war fund drives, the War Camp Community Service, Wartime National Food Administration, the YMCA and the YWCA, the American Red Cross nurses, and canteen workers. One reference in our collection described that when the African American 805th Pioneer Infantry passed through Kansas City, heading for Europe, they were served by an African American canteen committee supplied with candy, chewing gum, smokes, and matches. I'll go back up. There were also the organized women knitters and the Circle of Negro War Relief. Led by American heiress Anne Morgan, the Comité Américain pour la Région Dévastée, CARD, or American Committee for Devastated France, she took 350 American women volunteers to France, primarily in the Picardy region between 1917 and 1924, to help reconstruct war-torn France while the war was going on. They started their efforts. They set up first aid stations, distributed food, and helped rebuild structures and farms. The CARD volunteers built libraries, social centers, established visiting nurses programs, taught hygiene, which was greatly needed, and provided a leg up for people devastated by over 4 years of war. With all its volunteer war efforts, from war fund campaigns to comfort for servicemen and women in camps and near the front lines, the Knights of Columbus hewed to the slogan, "See him through." Major Leeson Tarleton, the U.S. Army Camp Hospital in Paris, wrote in 1919, "Since its very beginning, the KFC has been a friend, guide, and assistant to the medical corps. Its tireless secretaries have visited us many times every week, and many a bedfast soldier has anxiously awaited their cheery greetings, as well as the gifts of candy, cookies, fruit, chewing gum, tobacco, etc." Major General Eli Helmick, head of Services Supply, the American Expeditionary Forces, wrote, "Never before has welfare work played the important part that it has in this war, and the Knights of Columbus has played a great role in helping to make for the American Army its record as the most fit Army that was ever in the field." Chaplain William L. Hart, this is Captain Hart shown here, Chaplain Hart shown here. Knights of Columbus chaplains, or by regulation known as volunteer chaplains. I have to be careful with all this stuff. I'm in the heart of it right I have to be right. Everything has to, I know I have to know what I'm talking about. They served with the American Expeditionary Forces. They went everywhere with their men, giving the consolation or religion through all the days of the fighting. They were often referred to as the fighting shepherds of fighting flocks. Fathers Osias Busher, get that right? John DeVals, James Edding, and William Hart, who you see here, were among the priests often cited for bravery at the front. Father Hart was from St. Paul. During the Battle of St. Mihiel, he related that standing at the head of the crevice between two sharply rising hills through which the men were to rush at the enemy, I handed each some raisins or a piece of hard candy. Precious comfort in those terrible moments preceding the onrush that might end in death. Dr. P.A. Smythe was a surgeon with the American Red Cross, and he served in Vienna, Austria. And he was one of the few Americans that I've been able to find information about that was not on the Allied side. He was on, and he helped with the Central Powers during the war. And he rode home to Oklahoma, where he was from, January 1st, 1915. Germany and Austria will never be beaten. Can't be. The unfortunate thing was England's entry into the war, and England will pay dearly, I think. And he wrote home to his wife, and his son was named Ernest, and he says, yes, tell Ernest he can bet on Germany. On May 20th, he wrote, well, I guess I've written a lot just for nothing, as now it is almost certain that we'll be at war with Italy tomorrow. The Italian people want war, and war they will surely have, I fear. As one of the Austrian officers remarked this morning, the Italian soldier, well, this is him, not me speaking, the Italian soldier in the past has been chiefly famous by running faster than any of the other soldiers could. But this may be different. Italy entered the war on the Allied side on May 23rd. In one of his last letters, he wrote, Germany, the greatest nation on earth today, fighting for her life and national existence, perfectly willing to spill her last drop of blood for the fatherland, which is dearer to every German, man, woman, and child, than life itself. James Edward Hinchell, Ned, was in one of the transport companies, the U.S. Motor Transport Corps. He wrote, our work would consist of driving transport, big 5-ton Pierce Arrow trucks. It will be either more or less dangerous than the ambulance service. It does not matter. The important thing is that France needs right now munitions, transport drivers, more than she does ambulance drivers, which is why we came, or why I came at any rate. I do the most possible good wherever I'm wanted. I think that is the spirit of all in the American Field Service. He went on to write, the big war machine never ceases to amaze me. It's always new, always changing, and always wonderful. But the thing that impresses itself on me is the fact that it is so stupendous, and it moves along as smoothly as it does. Lieutenant Bartlett Travis went from the United States to Canada and joined the Royal Air Force there. And he wrote on August 17, 1918, I went out on my first patrol this morning, the chief purpose of which was to locate the armies, our lines, the German Army's lines, as no one is very familiar with this front. We got Archied. This was the term for German anti-aircraft fire. Like the devil going over, but outside of that, nothing eventful occurred, and the Archie only lasted a minute or so. As soon as we saw and heard it, the whole formation started to fly in S's, and only one burst came very near us. Stuff isn't very pleasant, though. It keeps one more or less on the jump, maneuvering the bus around. Called their planes buses. Richard Norton had organized the American Volunteer Motor Ambulance Corps in France in 1914. In 1917, he declined to join the U.S. Army Ambulance Service because he felt he would no longer be a gentleman volunteer. With his monocle, as it was written, gleaming in his eye, Richard Norton presented his drivers with a melancholic farewell. As gentlemen volunteers, you enlisted in this service, and as gentlemen volunteers, I bid you farewell. And A.P. Andrew, in September 1917, on offer to join the American Ambulance Service, wrote to his parents that disbanding the American Field Service meant the end of our freedom and distinction. He was commissioned as a major and later became a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Ambulance Service. Edward Ryder was in a U.S. YMCA Foreign Service operative. He wrote on July 24, 1918, in a pretty French town. This place is full of soldiers, coming and going, and billeted here for rest after strenuous work at the front. French and Americans with steel hats, jingling accoutrements, and long crawling trains of endless motor lorries, motorcycles, military motors, and occasional batteries of gray guns. There's a military hospital here in which I worked on a long Sunday afternoon, bringing in the wounded, carrying men to the operating room, helping to evacuate the men capable of being moved to hospitals far south, and leaving the space for new men. It's not pleasant work at first, but after a little while, one can walk through the death chamber and move a man without a tremor. I'm currently writing this moment at a table in a big concrete warehouse, where in company with 3 other gentlemen, I care for YMCA supplies, a carload of which we moved early this morning. We have everything here. Various brands of cigarettes, cigars, smoking tobacco, chewing tobacco, chocolate and cakes, in bars and lumps, cookies of all sorts and conditions, canned peaches, pineapples, pears, and condensed milk. African-American women who served as secretaries with the YMCA had a particularly difficult time with racism and understanding. The final total, and this is brand new scholarship, we just have found this out recently, the final total of African-American women to serve overseas amounted to 19. Before that, we only knew of 4. And we recently found that out, and we found it out from this picture that we recently acquired for the collection. At one point, 3 African-American women were left to assist 150,000 American Expeditionary Forces men without relief or help. While some YMCA huts were known to be segregated, many Army officials and Caucasian secretaries worked hard to oppose discrimination and see that things were made equal. The last YMCA hut for African Americans in France was closed on August 3, 1919. Led by 2 women, they were among those to close the camp, both having been given the longest period of active service of any of the colored women who had gone overseas. Anne Morgan, as I mentioned earlier, daughter of the American financier John Pierpont Morgan, with her friend Anne Murray Dyke, led an incredible effort to rebuild areas of France deeply affected by the ravages of modern war. In September 1914, before forming her relief efforts, but after visiting the Marne battlefield, she wrote, "What we saw with our own eyes of the horrors of war touched us so deeply that we resolved then and there to consecrate ourselves to the Allied cause as long as hostilities kept up." Global volunteer efforts did not cease with the Treaty of Paris at Versailles in 1919. Although most fighting was over, relief efforts against famine, agricultural failures, destruction of environments, and religious persecution continued. In large areas of Russia torn by revolutions, famine and disease required a huge volunteer turnout, again led by a fellow named Herbert Hoover. World War I had vastly transformed the range and scope of American volunteerism. Many had chosen to volunteer at home to help support the war effort. Thousands returned home from the war with impressions of the carnage, but also strengthened by the cultural bonds created by the conflict. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer any questions anybody might have, if I can. So I'll open the floor. Yes, sir.
I was curious, when you were talking about the volunteers, and that one doctor who volunteered for the
Hospitals?
yeah. Was that, what happened to those people when he came home? You know, there was already in this country, I know there was already a strong anti-German feeling even before the war. So anybody who volunteered to fight on the German side, or to do anything for the Germans, what happened to them when they came home?
Well, since he was a volunteer for the American Red Cross, nothing really did. He came back and worked in Oklahoma for the rest of his working days. So he was not really affected the same way that someone who had fought, say,
Okay.
going and fight on the other side, because it was considered a humanitarian effort. He just was a little radical and forward in his praise of the Germans and the Austrians. But from what we have of his later life, there wasn't really any recommendation. Okay.
The photograph that you showed of the African-American boy who volunteered for the,
Eugene Bullard.
right, he was one of the founding members of the Escadrille.
Yes.
And one of the other founding members grew up right here in Madison, Connecticut.
And it was,
He would refuse, when the airlines were being formed, he would refuse a pilot's license to fly for American Airlines.
well, he was also refused to fly in the American Air Service in World War I. And he was wounded in Verdun. He was one of the French Foreign Legion fighters there. And we found a lot of information about him when he was actually in the 1950s, early 60s, was an elevator operator at Rockefeller Center in New York. And one day, Dave Garraway, some of you remember, was the host of the Today Show, and he started talking to him as they were going up in the elevator, and he realized that this was an important fellow, so he brought him on air, and he interviewed him on air. We'd love to find film of that, but back then they didn't really keep a lot of good records for that. But yeah, Eugene Bullard was an incredible hero for France and regarded as less than human by the American Army. So yeah, you noticed his picture there. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you know if there were any Muslim volunteers from the U.S.?
Not that I've been able to determine. The problem with determining that is that they weren't segregated. You know, it's like the Native Americans and Japanese Americans and stuff. They just were in in every organization as they were. I've not seen that. Now, I've seen a lot about military units, especially in Russia and from North Africa, but not with volunteers. That's a good question. That's a good place for us to look. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How many individuals volunteered for the British and French armed forces from the United States?
Yeah, it was tough. There were about 350 with the French Foreign Legion. They couldn't join the French Army directly before the Americans entered the war. The British, they primarily were flyers, and I don't know exact figure on that, but it was probably in the low hundreds. And some served in the Army, especially with the Canadian Army, and not as much with the British Army. They were really more strict, with that. But I just recently acquired a collection of a fellow who went from the United States joined the Canadian Army, went overseas, and when the Americans joined, he stayed with the Canadians, and we acquired a broadside, which is a small printed piece of paper announcing an event, and it was Canadians and American baseball match, called a baseball match. And he was with the Canadian Army, but the Americans needed a pitcher. And so he pitched for the Americans, and his name is on the broadside as the pitcher for the Americans. And unfortunately, I don't know who won the game. But and it was interesting that after the war, with the inter-allied games that were created, basically to keep the men who were still there on occupation busy, so they didn't find out about French girls in Paris. The Canadians and the Americans were the only ones who played baseball. There were a lot of sports played, but they were the only ones who played, and the Americans won 2-1 in their 3-game series. So they took home the gold medal. There were only 2 medals, gold and silver. So they took home the gold medal, and the Canadians got the silver. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Were there any German, say, reservists who tried to get back to Germany that joined the armed forces?
Yes, there was a callback, and so yeah, many did. And I'll tell you one instance of that. It didn't happen that way, but we got a grouping of materials a few years ago. A fellow named Nicolaisen, who was a Dane, who was living in the German portion of Denmark at that time. He was drafted into German service. He was on the Western Front and learned his brother was killed on the Eastern Front in 1915. And so he decided to leave. He got on a train that went right along the border between the German Denmark and Denmark. It stopped at a station. He got off wearing his full, complete German uniform with his rifle, bayonet, and everything. He got off, went to a relative's house, and they buried him in their backyard. His brother lived in Connecticut, and I just thought of that. He did live in Connecticut. And so he got the last Danish ship out before the Americans came into the war. And so he came to Connecticut to work with his brother. He ran a boiler repair business. Of course, he got here and got drafted. So they put him in an American uniform, sent him back to France, and he was serving almost in exactly the same place he'd been serving as a German. And so after the war, his family found all his stuff, and luckily they buried it in a very nice container. And so his descendants donated the materials to the war, so we have his German uniform, German equipment next to his American uniform, his American equipment. And he wasn't a combat soldier, he was a mechanic. But he's the only one that we know of that served in both the German Army and the American Army. But there were a lot that went back and fought with the German Army. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, good. I'm glad that you all came this afternoon. I appreciated having your good attention. And anytime you're in Kansas City, Missouri, look us up. All you have to do is Google World War I Museum. You'll get us. we put that on there so that you get us right when it's searched for. Thank you very much for coming.
Doran, thank you. As is our custom, we have a little reception downstairs in the lobby.